So they were noticing at work, you get served at home, and your wife in that moment.
Yeah.
But did she have to come to a place where she realized she had seen it the whole time too?
She knew things were not well, but it wasn't until I confessed to my parents and my wife. I called my parents over, and I still remember that experience.
We cry here, so it's good.
I don't talk a lot about that confession, but the pain had gotten so great that I just needed to be free of it, and I didn't care about the consequences anymore.
Hello and welcome to the ReConnect podcast, a weekly show sponsored by the Anasazi Foundation and powered by Sturry Studios. I'm Ganel-Lyn, your host. I'm so grateful you've joined us, where we have conversations to help you strengthen your most important relationships and reconnect with those that matter most. Welcome to the ReConnect podcast. I'm Ganel-Lyn, and I'm so grateful to have this conversation with you today and with my friend Jason Coombs. I have had a lot of prayer and pondering about this conversation today, and I'm grateful it's finally happening because we've been trying to make this happen for a while now. And I always love when there's a little bit of a resistance in making something happen and scheduling it, because it tells me that it's going to be amazing. Mm-hmm. So it means there's a lot of other people praying too that this conversation will finally happen, because I think what I've come to know is what we're talking about today touches every family on the planet, and that is addiction. Yeah. Jason has recently released his first, is it your first book?
It's my first book, my debut.
And tell us the title of your new book.
It is called Unhooked: How to Help an Addicted Loved One Recover. And essentially it's a combination of evidence-based modalities that work in treatment centers across the world, but it's couched in my family's journey through the process, as well as the things that they tried that didn't work and the things that they did that ultimately helped me transcend the addiction.
So this is a personal story that has culminated with this book, but it also, your journey includes a recovery center. Where are you based out of, and what is that called?
Yeah, so my wife and I started Brickhouse Recovery back in 2014 up in the Boise, Idaho area. So I'm originally from Salt Lake City, actually Bountiful.
Oh, yeah. So this is coming home because we're taping in the Sturry Studios in North Salt Lake.
Yeah, so we used to call it the glass bubble.
Yeah.
So I was raised right up the street here. But yeah, we opened up there, and Brickhouse Recovery is an outpatient treatment center. It's faith-based, which is cool because we get a lot of folks from different walks and different backgrounds and different hang-ups around spirituality and belief and connection, and we get to sort of unpack that stuff with them and then lay it out on the table and have them look at it and repack it in a way that serves them and leave the rest that doesn't.
I think that's so important, especially with we're presented by the Anasazi Foundation, and they too have a faith journey portion of their walk experience. And before we started taping, I shared a little bit of my background, and our viewers and listeners for this podcast know that God and faith is my soul, and it's kind of infiltrates every part of me. But we know that our listeners don't always define God the same way, and that, like you said, you have to unpack God and get God down to what God really, this pure, joyful place, because it becomes this story in our heads, and our religious maybe journey wasn't always so nurturing and loving, right? And then there's shame that comes into it, especially with addiction. And so I think anytime we're talking recovery, I always feel grateful that there's some part of this that's a faith lens, and yet out of respect to those that they're just at the place where maybe there's something bigger than them. Maybe they're not sure, and that's okay to be right in that place. But just know that that's not about one religion per se. It's just that I don't know another way to do my journey through life. And so if you want authenticity in a podcaster, you're going to have some faith that's always going to creep up in the conversation, and especially when we're going to sit down. Some of my podcast interviews, it's not as faith heavy. But I don't think you can talk about addiction recovery without talking about how faith plays into that. So I am grateful that that's also where you come from on this, Jason. Okay, so let's take our listeners back a little bit. I love that your book deals with the relationship people around the person that's struggling with the addiction, because that is a party, no pun intended, right? Like what it does, especially at the ReConnect podcast, what it does to connection when there's addiction. I will try to not get too emotional so we can have a conversation, but the addiction stories in our family and every family that I've talked with, it starts to wreak havoc. So take us back a little bit where you were at and the time frame that we're talking about in your own recovery.
Yeah, happy to. And I love how you just said that it's difficult to talk about this topic of addiction without bringing faith into it. And I kind of look at it like if you're going to talk about the dark, you can't not talk about the light. And that's essentially what we're addressing here, is how do we help people lean into the light, whatever that is, and
the light increases as the dark increases
yeah.
too. So I see the light in you. It comes from a place that has had to fight through the dark. That's a really important point.
Yeah, absolutely. And when a client comes into my treatment center and we're sitting in front of each other for the very first time, I'm assuming that they're struggling with light. They're struggling with faith because they're seeking it in a counterfeit version
of numbing
and
escape.
They worship that.
Yeah.
Like whether it's the bottle or whether it's drugs or whether it's porn. Yeah. Compulsive overeating, which I also am in recovery for. All of those are escapes to to fill that void and fill that connection. And we talk about that. And it can be trite to a degree because it can be overemphasized. But when it comes to filling that void with something that's going to kill you and that rips marriages apart, and in my life, like to go back to the genesis of where this book and treatment center all sprouted from, is it goes back to this relationship that started with alcohol in high school. And
so did you find it because you were just at a high school party, or did you find it in another way?
I held out for a long time because I grew up, in a church setting, and some of my friends began.
No more on drinking.
Yeah, no drinking, no
But
drugs.
underneath, that's what kids were doing.
Kids were starting to do it,
Yeah.
back then. And so I'll never forget the decision. And I had held out until I was a junior in high school, which for me, it sounds young, right? But for me, that was really
not
late.
In your faith community. That's,
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe for the rest of the world, you're already drinking by the time you're, 15. But if you've made it to your junior year in the world,
that's pretty good.
Yeah.
And so,
So were you hooked the minute you took your first drink?
The first drink that I tried was followed by 5 more shots of whiskey. So it was a blackout experience. So I woke up the next morning. I still remember it was junior year of high school. I was at my buddy Sam's house. My other buddy Fonz was there, and the 3 of us drank.
Sam and Fonz.
Sam and Fonz.
That's a party ready.
My boys.
That's a party ready to start right there, right? Josh, Fonz, and Sam find the whiskey, and you black out, and the next day?
Yeah. So I woke up in that blackout, wondering what I had done the night before, and I heard the stories about what I did in that blackout, and they were funny, and I was the life of the party, and it was this void began to fill. Like, that's the person I've always strived to be.
You know what? That's so interesting, Jason, because I think that's what Hollywood shows about drinking.
Yep.
And I think that's what our kids are seeing in movies and commercials, and and they're only seeing that side of it. I think that's a really important part to bring out with addiction, that it's not that, but it feels like some of that. It does take away those inhibitions, and so then you felt like you were showing up more like you wanted Jason to really be. Is that what was happening?
Yeah, I think again, when I speak with people who have chemical dependency or substance use disorder, there is a common thread throughout our upbringing, and it's a feeling of inadequacy. It's a feeling of not good enough, insecurity, and early on in my life, I began to escape that feeling through adrenaline rushes. So I would, I'd do backflips on skis. I would jump off people's houses into snowbanks, and just anything that would give me a rush. Or I would race down the freeway and dangle from the Jeep, the Jeep roll bars. Crazy, stupid things, but it gave me that
high.
Rush. It gave me that high, and I got hooked on that. And so when alcohol was poured on that, and then you combine it, and then you start skiing and drinking.
And you underlying that whole experience with normal teenage insecurities and this hole. So every addiction starts to feel like it fills that hole. So for someone that's listening to this that doesn't deal with that chemical, that was never my thing, right? But for me, I remember coming into a place in my life after a lot of chemotherapy where food became very distorted. I was taking medicine that made me throw up. So then it became physically easy, and I'm a busy mom, and I'm trying to recover from this vulnerability of this long chronic illness, right? And food is supposed to feel nurturing and grounding, and then it becomes this very distorted relationship. Or for other listeners that are listening to this, and it becomes that with porn or shopping or gambling, right? It's that hole that you were feeling, and alcohol filled that in, and then it added to this adrenal addiction that you already had. How long did you stay in that place? How bad did that get?
Well, I stayed, it was like this, a relationship with alcohol and drugs. It progressed. I started to experiment with more. And throughout my teens into my early 20s, I ended up went to Brazil for 2 years to serve a mission for my church. And then when I came back, it was reintroduced.
So for those that know, these listeners know my son just returned in December from Zimbabwe. So classically, did you give that addiction up for those 2 years? Did you feel like, okay, I am totally a different guy. I'm going to come home in a totally different headspace? Or did you struggle while you were on your mission?
That's such a good question, because there's more to that answer than just that I was reintroduced to it, because I did break my ankle in Brazil. I was playing soccer with some people, and I broke my ankle, and I was prescribed pain pills. And what's interesting, though, is that first pill that I took after I had been clean for a couple of years, a few years probably, it ignited something in me. See, I have this allergic reaction to substances, and that is substance use disorder. It affects the body, and it affects the mind. The body is that as soon as I ingest a pill or I ingest a drink, I have that abnormal reaction where one's not enough.
And it's shocking to others when you say, oh, you just took one drink and you're done, right? That's not your response.
Yeah, like on the plane when I see people hand a half a glass of wine to the stewardess because we're going to land, I'm like, that's alcohol abuse.
Yeah.
You're throwing it away.
Yeah.
That was never me. You always
Did you stop cold turkey before you went on your mission, or did you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because I wouldn't say that I was addicted before my mission. I had dabbled, but I was able to cut it off because there were so many benefits to using pre-mission that when I took those pills on my mission, it ignited that physiological
allergic reaction.
But what's crazy about addiction is that's not the only side of it, because if that was the only side of it, then you just don't touch it. It's like, okay, I'm allergic to peanuts. I'm not touching peanuts because last time I touched peanuts, I went to the hospital. So
Right.
no more peanuts. But
You would think.
you would think, but with addiction, there's this mental side of it where that's where the illness, it is actually classified as a mental health disorder. It's in the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual for Mental Illness as a bona fide disease, and it's because it's the thinking process that leads up to ingesting the first drink or the first drug that is insane. It's insane.
Because you know that it makes you sick, like a peanut allergy, but you still run to it.
Exactly.
And that is because it continues to falsely make you feel like you're feeding the whole.
Yep.
And then that dance continues and continues. So you have this experience on your mission. You come home. Are you right back into it? Or take us along that timeline of getting married and starting your family and where the addiction kind of fast forwarded.
Yeah, great question. Right when I got home from my mission, it was a series of seemingly unimportant decisions, like, and I'll share this here, like viewing pornography.
Yeah.
Like I tried my first drink a couple of months later on a camping trip with one of my mission buddies, actually. And throughout that process, I believe that you go through this sort of callus over your mind, like a blindness, and your heart starts to harden. You stop being sensitive to intuition and insight, and that process of the blindness of the mind and that hardness of the heart morphed me into someone who was more based on self. And when you're in that space, it's really hard to differentiate what's right or wrong, or to kind of have that intuition of red flags, like warnings. And so in 2003, after I had been married, after I had returned home from my mission, a few years, I got home in 99, and here it's 2003, so 4 years later, driving down the freeway and I get in a car accident. And
Had you been drinking?
No, I was actually sober. We were just going to visit my parents on a Sunday night to have Sunday dinner. But
Did your wife know that you were, and were you using once you were already married?
no, I kept it really secret.
So she didn't know.
Mm-mm.
But I think before you go further, I think that's super important to know. If you love someone that deals with an addiction, or you're fighting an addiction, and I have come to know that all of us have something. We all have that place that is our natural default place to go to numb. Because to feel uncomfortable, to feel insecure, to feel stressed, tired, worried, any of those emotions, the natural response is, wait, we don't want to feel this way. And so for you, you may be listening to this thinking, yeah, alcohol, and I can't take a prescription drug. My doc is always like, when I've dealt with so much pain, like, please, I don't love that feeling.
Yeah.
But I have other ways in which I go to control. I go to perfectionism. Those are the ways in which I can get addictive, because then that helps negate or control this vulnerability that I don't want to have. I think we all have that area where we are vulnerable. We may not have an allergic reaction.
Yeah.
We may not eat until we're sick, or drink until we're sick, or take drugs and hide it. But we all have that. And so I think it's important to know, though, that you said it changed you. You stopped feeling connection.
Mm-hmm.
You were not soft, aware of others. You became very self-driven and self-centered. And I think if you're a loved one of someone that struggles with addiction, you can see when that happens. I can. The people I love that really are in their addiction, it's painful to me. I want to scream. I'm angry at whatever that is, porn, drugs, alcohol, whatever, because I lose them to that. And I can see that they're almost like trapped, and the sense of who they are is numbed.
Darkened.
Yeah, and you can't get there. So did your wife have a sense that you weren't fully present?
Yeah. We began those conversations of, hey, what's wrong? You seem to always be off, or you're not coming home when you say you're going to come home. So there were a lot of hiding.
I'm feeling like sick for her.
Yeah.
And I'm feeling sick for you because, you're not able to say, hey, I'm drinking. Were you drinking and using drugs?
Yeah. Yeah. But at that point, I was just dabbling because what happened after the car accident is really where things
snowballed,
mounted, because it was immediately after the car accident. I went back to work, a couple days later, and I had a coworker ask me if I wanted to go to lunch. And when we were at lunch, he ended up inquiring about my accident, and he said, have you ever seen anybody for your pain management? And I had said no, and he said, well, I'm seeing this doctor if you're interested in meeting him. He does really good hydrotherapy. He's really fixed my neck and my back. And not only that, but he prescribes the good stuff. And at that moment, he reaches into his center console of his car, and he pulled out literally a jumbo-sized bottle of the most
Oxycontin.
potent drugs. Yeah, pharmaceutical grade heroin is basically what
that's all it is.
Oxycontin. And he offered me a couple. And
I'm like sweating for you because that's not my drug of choice, but for someone that has had a reaction, right? What did you feel in that moment?
So check it out. He pulled out a dollar bill. He put the pill inside the folded dollar bill, and then he pulled out 2 pennies, and he began to crush the pill inside the dollars so that the powder would stay in. And then he poured it out onto a CD case. And for those that don't know what a CD is, that's how we used to listen to music.
You gotta laugh in the middle of a conversation with addiction. When I talk about suicide, I'm like, you will hear suicide humor because sometimes you just gotta break it down.
Oh, it can be so heavy.
It's so heavy. And you know what? I think this is important for parents, for loved ones. We really want this podcast and your book is very focused on what do your loved ones need to know. This is what's going on.
Yeah,
like
that's right.
A parent's like, oh, pennies and a dollar bill and a CD. There's nothing there that looks like drug paraphernalia.
Right.
There's no needles. There's no pipes.
Right.
And that was the way in which he could get it into his system the fastest.
Yeah, so it's so crazy because he drew up 2 white lines, and he snorted the first one, and then he offered me the next one, and I kind of looked at him with that. I haven't snorted anything before. Like, I've done things.
This
but
is a
this
line.
Is like
if I step over this line.
Literal line.
Yeah.
This is a literal line.
And when you're in addiction too, that's the other weird head trip, is that you keep giving yourself the boundary.
Yeah.
Right? I won't ever. Well, I haven't done.
Yep.
I haven't done this. I haven't done this. I haven't and then, so was that a line for you, literally?
I'll never do the hard stuff.
Never.
Ever. So here's that. But, the voice in your head, when it comes in and you begin to justify, well, I really do have pain.
I had an accident for real.
Oh, and then he said this, and then he said, oh, by the way, I recommend that you do it this way because this protects your stomach lining.
Oh, so then it's even more rationalized.
And it hits you faster.
Uh-huh.
And so there are 2 benefits to snorting. So I proceeded with that, and
that was it.
That was it. That was when all of my problems in one moment
went away.
Disappeared.
Yep.
Disappeared. And we forget, why do people drink? Why do people use
Why are
drugs?
people willing to risk their jobs, their families, all of their finances? This is why.
That's right. Because we don't if we're trying to help someone with with a pain or with a struggle, we talk to them about the consequences. Like the warnings. Do you know where this is going to lead?
Yes.
This is affecting your health. This is affecting your family. This is affecting your marriage.
But in that moment.
But we forget that the reason that people act the way they act and behave the way they behave is because of the benefits. And so in order to help someone, it's about, and we can get more into this later, but it's more about exploring that cost and benefit with them, with non-judgment, and in a relationship of rapport.
Yeah, because like if you're going to take this example of OxyContin and then you talk to someone about the cost benefit analysis of that, in that moment every problem goes away, but we stop having the conversation. That means all the good goes away as well, right?
Yeah.
really, because that's that fake temporary version. That's not true joy, which only comes when you also feel sorrow. So if you do everything you can to eliminate the negative or the sorrow in your life, I've been working on this last few years based on my childhood. I did not want my kids to ever experience fear or see mom out of control emotionally. Well, then you modulate so much that you're not ever in those emotions, right?
Yeah.
My kids also didn't see these. And I have a beautiful 15-year-old daughter that is super comfortable in her skin, and she'll say to me, Mom, it's so good to once in a while just see you cry and have a bad day, because that's so human. And it's been super healing for me to realize that doesn't mean it's going to be out of control. But you're in that moment, whatever your drug of choice is, all the problems go away, but Jason goes away.
Yeah.
Right? We lose Jason. We lose Jason that gets angry, and Jason that gets stressed, and Jason that loves deeply, because Jason's just in happy zone land.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so I took him up on that offer.
Yeah?
And go to see that doctor.
And that was it.
That turned out to be
The biggest love affair of your life.
Well, it was Utah's largest OxyContin drug ring.
Yeah.
That I became a patient of. And
nice.
Yeah.
Nice, not in a nice way. Right?
Not in a nice, not in a nice.
Yeah, yeah. And that played out in the media eventually, didn't it?
Yeah. And he got busted. It was raided, and then. But what happens when 300? And this is relevant to the viewers, because what happens when 300 patients in an opiate ring lose their supplier overnight?
Oy, that's a whole nother trickle effect.
Now they're going through. They're kicking, which is going through the withdrawals, and they start to buy them up off the streets.
Yep. And
at $100 a pop.
In any way they can get them.
Any way they can. And as soon as the pills dry up on the black
supply.
market, the cartels caught wind. They knew that this was going down, and they start supplying and pumping heroin into the Utah market.
And that was, give me the time range, because we lost a lot of people to some yucky heroin.
Yep.
And it was like back to back. I went to a few of those funerals of people that I served in my church.
Yep.
And it was because the batches became very, very destructive that were out on the market.
Yeah, it basically since 2004 till now, it's been
a flood.
Been just, And that's the reason why. It's not like all of a sudden everyone's like, you know what?
Heroin.
It's Thursday. You know, I'm gonna go check it out. No, it was already underway, but it was under the guise of legal doctor justification, and then.
So where were you at in this? You were, give us an average week or a day for you. What was happening in your life?
Oh, I used around the clock, and.
And did your wife still not know?
She didn't know for a while until one day I was out mowing my lawn, and I still remember the song I was listening to on my headphones, and it was a Red Hot Chili Pepper song. Unparalleled Universe. I remember the lyrics. And
which is ironic.
Yeah, I mean, it was that significant of a moment.
Yeah.
The sun's on my back, shirt's off, and I'm just out mowing my lawn, and I'm high. And an unmarked vehicle pulls up to my curbside, and an agent gets out with a manila envelope in his hand, and he walked up to me, and he handed me the manila envelope, and said, I recommend you get an attorney, have a nice day.
And you have been served.
And I opened up that envelope, and I started to read the charges, and I'm looking at felony after felony after felony after felony after misdemeanor, and I'm counting up the years that I'm looking at if convicted, and I'm facing up to multiple decades in the Utah State Penitentiary.
Were you selling as well, or just using?
I didn't think it was selling. I was just exchanging them for money.
Yeah.
I wasn't a drug dealer.
Because this is where addiction takes you.
Yeah.
And this is important. Like, we are not making light of this at all. This is painful when you're the parent or a spouse or a child of this user, right? And you are watching the destruction happen. Were you maintaining a career at this time?
Yeah, I was actually working for the largest television station in the market at the time, and they started to notice my behavior change. They started to ask me why I was so skinny. I lost, 30, 40 pounds in a 5-month period, just emaciated. You could see the veins in my neck, and, you could see my ribs. And I just said, oh, I'm training for ski season, and lies. But
Which are the most painful thing for a loved one? It's the lies. It's
the
not
lies.
even the addiction. It's the lies, right?
Yeah.
Because back to ReConnect, we break connection with that dishonesty. But it's scary. It's so scary to show up and say, this is who I really am and this is what I'm really going through.
yeah.
So they were noticing at work, you get served at home, and your wife in that moment.
Yeah.
But did she have to come to a place where she realized she had seen it the whole time too?
She knew things were not well, but it wasn't until I confessed to my parents and my wife. I called my parents over, and I still remember that experience.
We cry here, so it's good.
I don't talk a lot about that confession, but the pain had gotten so great that I just needed to be free of it, and I didn't care about the consequences anymore. And
That's such an important, Jason, I have to stop you there, because isn't it ironic that the pain we're trying to suppress, the addiction gets to the point where you're like, I can't do this any longer. I have to tell the truth no matter what comes out. And that's the beginning, right? Is that the beginning, do you think, for recovery? Is that when you finally say the truth to someone, just one person?
yeah, I was moving through the stages of change, and I began to contemplate my life, and that's the second stage, which is contemplation. It's ambivalence of there were still benefits to using, but the pain was so great that I just needed to share. And so in that sharing, it was like the pressure valve was released. But what was interesting is the reaction of my parents. And my mom speaks about this, that I was expecting her to say, Jason, let's get you help. It went differently. It actually went in a direction that perpetuated my disease, because what she said to me was, and my poor sweet mom, she didn't know
Because
any
she's
better.
such a fan of yours, and
She said,
she loves
yeah,
it.
she is one of my biggest fans, and she said, Jason, you're not an addict.
Oh.
Her denial actually reinforced my
disease.
Yes. to think about that and say, yeah,
Okay, so
I'm not.
If you hear nothing else and you're a loved one today and your loved one comes to you and says, I am addicted, believe them.
Yeah.
Just believe them. Because for them to even get to the point to say, I have a problem, there's a problem, whether you want to see it or not.
Well, I think even
So would you say to a loved one, just listen? If
that's
you can't,
what I would say.
if you can't say anything,
because I think it's hard to just believe without knowing the facts. But just listen and not
Just
jump
listen.
to a decision
a label
or an
or-
assumption.
Mhm.
But when her son is, and I was in fetal position, laying on the floor, just bawling, sharing this with my family, and for her to say that, bless her heart, immediately the ego came back, and I was like, oh, okay, they're going to help me. And so they, rather than asking me for help, or if I wanted help, we all looked at the doctor like, okay, how are we gonna, we blamed him, which he had his part. But at the end of the day, I'm stuck with this.
You're an adult male still choosing to use.
Yeah. And so they started to rally around me and pay for things, and I eventually did go to treatment, but it was court ordered, and so I was in and out of jails, and I didn't get sober, wound up on the streets.
So you're living on the street, and your wife is where in this journey?
Yeah, my life started to circle the drain, and at that time my wife was rallying around me, and she would try to set some boundaries, but they were pretty soft boundaries.
Because what do you do? I mean, what do you say to loved ones now when your loved one comes to you in the fetal position saying, but then now there's this other thing of this legal fight, and so it's easy to put the blame, which then just delays the recovery
Right.
process, right? You had lost your job, and was she kick you out and then let you back? Is that where the boundary would get weird?
I did my best to control that relationship as much as I could by keeping my stuff minimal. I would just share the bare minimum, which is another thing to note, is minimizing. People in addiction really minimize the problem. And I minimized it to my family. I wasn't telling them that I was using a lot more than just my prescription. Like I had advanced to cocaine, and I had advanced to a lot of alcohol, and so it's a progressive illness. But yeah, my wife at the time was pretty clueless, and I mean, how do you know what you don't know? And I kept
Yeah,
it
if you
pretty
don't have,
separate.
I think that's the gift of your book, especially in your work, is that how do you know if you don't know? How do you, if you don't have this disease, whatever that addiction is, then you don't even know what questions to ask in the moment, right? So for someone that is in that moment where their loved one is telling them, what would be a first question to ask?
Well, I think I think the first question to ask is really, where are they at in the process? Because that's one thing I do teach is, in the book, it's identify where your loved one is at in those stages of change, because it's not black and white where you're using or you're in recovery, or
There's a lot in the middle.
there's this whole journey. It's like someone who's a compulsive overeater, and it's like asking them to stop eating sugar and carbs and go to the gym and exercise and lose weight every single day and sweat on the treadmill. Like, to get there, it takes pain, it takes some natural consequences, and it takes volition. They got to want to do it to sustain it. So there's this internal motivator that's got to be tapped into, and that's where I think I help people understand that it's not just the external stuff that you do. The external stuff, consequence-wise and boundary-wise, which are really, really important, those you put in place first, but that's not the end game. The end game is you put those in place so that natural consequences can foster that internal change where the inner motivation comes
Is
out.
not based on losing your spouse, losing your job, losing your kids. It's about something inside of you. So you were in this point where you're homeless, and in the essence of time, how long did that stage go, and was that the last before the beginning of healing?
Yeah, that was a few years where I was in and out of jails and in and out of rehabs and on and off the streets. And the turning point of all of it was when I found out that I was going to be a dad. And I had been divorced. My wife had left me, and as she should. And I discovered that this child was coming into the world with someone, with his birth mom. And that experience in the hospital of watching him behind the glass fight for his life for a week's time, and then placing him into the arms of another family to raise with adoption.
Why was he fighting for his life? Was his birth mom also dependent?
It was some medical complications.
Okay.
I can't pinpoint
Okay.
what it was, but I know what I was feeling at the time, and that was I took a lot of responsibility for that, and that compiled the shame.
And that woke you up.
That was the moment when I contemplated my life as he was fighting for his life. I contemplated mine, and I actually went down into my car, and I wrote him a letter. And as I wrote that letter, I made him some promises, and one of those promises was that I was going to change my life and become the birth father that he could be proud of. That I wouldn't, and I didn't say this in the letter, but I didn't want him to grow up looking at his birth father as a junkie and being in that negative example. But that one day he and I would sit down, and I would share my story with him, and I would tell him why I placed him for adoption, and that it was out of love. It was out of understanding that he deserved more than I could provide him. And what's cool about that is 2 weeks ago, I was able to meet up with him, and I was able to have
So
that
crazy you would
conversation.
just say that, because as you were saying that, I could feel, I have how I know when the Spirit is talking to me, and what a cool thing that was going to happen, and it already has happened. So wonderful. So from that point, how did that trajectory of recovery look for you, and where are you at today?
Yeah, from that point, it's been a commitment to take everything that I've learned and experienced and bless the lives of others with it. And so my recovery began there. We've spent a lot of time in the problem, but there's a beautiful side of the story that we haven't tapped into, and that's my rediscovery of a God that I can lean into, and the Spirit. I call it the sunlight of the Spirit a lot, because as I leaned into that sunlight, it began to shine on my life and on my soul, and healing began to happen, and a relationship and a bond with my Creator formed from my darkest hours. And now I have, a little over 10 years of abstinence, which is cool. That's big, but I think what's bigger is I can stand up proud today and say that I've made that promise and fulfilled that promise with my son. And today I have a wife, and today I'm happy in my marriage, and it is full of honesty.
Based on honesty.
It's fully transparent. Bryn knows me better than anyone, and I love that. And we have twins that are 3 years old, and I have a relationship with my birth son that I'll probably go see him sometime this week while I'm in town.
And how's he doing?
He's doing awesome. He scored 4 goals in his soccer game 2 days ago, so he's killing it.
Well, I think that's important, because recovery, I think what's important is that you probably had many treatment options and experiences, and each one of those added to the layer of your full abstinence experience of 10 years, right?
Yeah.
And that you found God in your darkest place, your Creator, whatever way you describe. I think we often think He wants to have a hands-off relationship with us, and when we have everything figured out, then we can come to Him. And it's actually, that's the biggest lie, right? We like a parent who wants to be there for their child, they want to be there in the dark, and that is where, like you said, is the sunlight, if we keep returning to, is brighter than any heroin, brighter than any drug, shopping, porn, food, whatever that is, right? But we have to almost train ourselves to have that experience, and removing the drug so that you can be in that place is the first step, right?
Yeah.
What you're doing now is a culmination of all the treatment you've gone through and all the things you've experienced. Did you go back to school? Or is Brickhouse a culmination of what you found worked for you and what didn't, and what support do you give families now?
Well, when I was 5 years old, we wrote out our vision boards, and I wrote, "I want to own a drug rehab." No.
I'm looking at Jason like, what?
That was not my dream.
You were very inspired.
At all.
That should have been a warning.
Yeah, it's like,
God's like, you know what? I'm going to take you through some stuff if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, my teacher would have said, let's get you into some counseling real quick. But so right after I got out of treatment, for the 5th time.
5th time.
And last time, hopefully, if I don't relapse.
Right, by the grace of God.
Yeah, I mean,
every day.
Right, it's not one of these actually. It's more of just making sure that I keep the fence far away from the cliff's edge. But I got a job selling hot dogs.
But I think 5 times is important for families that are fatigued.
Yeah, it takes.
You have to hear that.
Yeah.
And families, wives and husbands, or even parents that have said, this is my boundary, I can't have a relationship, that's okay as well. Would you say that is true?
Yeah, I think it takes what it takes.
And sometimes you are saying, I've got to walk away, or I am not able to have contact with you right now because you're not making choices that put you into recovery, and that it's a process.
Yeah.
It's not a one and done.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so I got a job selling hot dogs for $6 an hour.
Okay, I love it.
And a dad, a gentleman came up and bought a hot dog from me, and he asked how my day was going. And I was 72 days sober, and had a mustard stain on my shirt, and I was standing out in the hot sun by a hot dog grill. Not super stoked about that job, pretty humiliated actually. But he asked me how my day was, and the classic overshare. For people in early recovery, we sometimes just
What?
run our mouths. And
We want everyone in recovery.
yeah, he's like, how's your day? And I was like, oh, it's great. I'm 72 days sober off drugs and alcohol. I just got out of rehab and I did blah, 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 blah. And
Would
he's
you like a hot dog?
yeah, it's a little bit too much information. But what was cool about that is he said, can I ask you a couple questions? Because his son was struggling. And in that moment, with that customer,
You gave away what you had.
I felt purpose. Like
Yeah.
I felt like what I had gone through had meaning finally.
Yeah.
And that was where the spark hit. Like, this is what I want to do.
Yes.
And so I took that and I ran with it. And I leaned into going back to graduate school, and I got my master's degree in communications. In that process, my thesis was this book. And so what turned into a class project of writing down, the first version was 5 keys to help an addict. And now it has become not just a class paper, but I have worked on it for literally 10 years. I have worked and written this thing out.
Yeah, by the way, for all of you that write me and message me about being an author and a speaker, it's a process.
It's an organic process.
It's
A labor
giving
of love,
birth
as my
that
cousin
goes,
said.
yes, and it takes years off your life sometimes. So, yeah.
But it's such a beautiful process.
It is,
too,
it
right?
is, it is. It's this living child that gets passed around. A book is
Mhm.
beautiful because I write for that same reason. It's so that it gets shared and then it gets passed to the next neighbor, and then you get those I call them for the one letters, right?
Yeah,
That one person that reads it and goes, oh,
for the one.
for the
letters.
one.
Oh,
I have lots
I gotta
of for
write
the
that
ones.
down.
Yeah, and I shared with you too that I love that addiction is a way in which you find God, and you have found God, but you have found this amazing, beautiful purpose. Brickhouse Recovery has a service that allows support for family and addicts, right? And how long have you been open in the Boise area?
2014, so we're reaching our year 5.
Year
So,
5.
yeah.
And your wife is in partnership with you
Mhm.
on this?
Yeah.
And where do you feel like if you could say to a family right now that is struggling and they're in that place of great for Jason, great that he went back to school and he's written this book and he has this new family and he has this recovery program that he's started where he's taken all of this hell and provided a gateway to heaven, right, for people. You can quote me on that
I
one
like
too.
that one too.
But I'm tired, and I am so tired of the cycle. I'm so tired of the lies. I'm so tired of the cycle. I don't know how to show up for my loved one more time because it's dashing my hopes. You know, I mean, we forget that the family members are also dealing with their own addictions and issues and struggles. So all this happening here is triggering their stuff. I know in my family, that's been the same for me, is that some of my responses have been out of sadness and fear because I have already walked that with someone else, right? What do you say to those people, either to the addict that says, it's not worth it and I'm done? I speak to those people often in the work I do, that we're not better without you, even though I know this addiction makes you think the world would be better without you. That is a lie. I think you're an example of what you have coming to offer. What do you say to the family members that are just so tired?
Yeah, there's hope. That's the beauty, is that hundreds of thousands of my friends and loved ones have recovered from this. People that are very close to me, and people that I just get to hear their stories in the recovery movement. So there is this movement happening, and sometimes it can feel so isolating and alone, like there's no hope.
And heavy.
But there are things that you can do today, regardless of if your addicted loved one changes today. Like that's not the idea. The idea is to know where you end and where others begin, and where you end, that distance between, like in that hula hoop that you have, there's a lot you can do. And that's getting yourself healthy, and that's getting yourself empowered so that you can then reach across and influence the right way, out of love, not fear, out of hope, not despair, not in depression or anxiety, but more in compassion and empathy. And that's the most hopeful message that I can share, is that when you get to that place, then you have influence. And that's the idea.
So I'm crying for podcast listeners. They can't see it. You can maybe hear it. So I choose 2 words for the year. Because I'm a perfectionist, I have to have 2 instead of 1, because then I'll get too hyper-focused. My 1 word this year is faith. I have a bracelet here. Faith is written on the inside, on the outside, my other word, which is influence.
Oh, I love it.
And I fought that word because I didn't know what God was meaning by that. I didn't want it to turn into Instagram followers or Twitter followers, which I'd love to meet you there and social media. But a friend of mine said influence is not really what you're thinking. It's actually what has been your why, and that is, can I influence the people I love? I can't save them. When you lose a sister to suicide, you learn that pretty fast. When you watch loved ones with addiction, you learn that pretty fast. When you're a parent, you learn it pretty fast that you don't have control, but you do have influence. And I love how you said that hula hoop. If you stay in that space and work on your own junk, when I'm showing up in that place, that also gives me permission to have a boundary with my loved one.
That's right.
And say, you know what, today, the most loving thing I can do for you is to not have contact. Because
right.
I won't be coming at you with influence. I'll be coming at you with control.
Yep.
And I want to come at you with love and a healthy boundary. And when we can give ourselves permission to do that, I can feel right now that listeners that are tired are taking a breath. Like, oh, that means it's okay, because the fear is, if I pull back, I'm not showing love. And sometimes the most loving thing we do is we say, in my hula hoop space, I'm not in a good space. I'm trying to control your behavior, and I'm being sucked into the weeds or down the rabbit hole with you. And that's not loving. So thank you for giving permission to our listeners, and hope that there is a movement of recovery. If you have met someone as amazing as Jason, you'll know what that looks like. Because you do know God. Like, you and I could do a whole nother podcast just about God, right? Let's do it. Because I know that I've come to find God in my darkest places. Yeah. And it wasn't, I do love my organized religion because it's the vehicle, it's the little wagon I sit in to get there. But that's not where God is for me. I found God in those dark spots, right? So thank you for taking that dark to show light, and thank you for being honest and vulnerable. I know you have blessed people. Where can people find you and find your book if they want more of the Jason magic?
Yeah, I'll give you the link for the show notes.
Let's do that.
In the show notes, you guys can seek it. But we also have a Facebook group called the Recovery Movement.
I love it.
And so,
isn't that great? Like, we're beating back the addiction in
right.
the world. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know what's cool is celebrities are coming forward, and they are
being
championing
honest.
This, just like with mental health
Yeah.
and suicide prevention, which I love. So yeah, there's this army gathering.
There is.
Up against.
And we're
these
going to win,
issues.
by the way.
That's
We are
right.
going to win. I know there's so many days where we hear the headlines and see another celebrity die of overdose. We see another celebrity take their life. But we are, the light always beats out the dark.
That's
and a
right.
little bit of light can do that. And so a little bit of dark can't beat out all of the light. So people can find you on the Recovery Movement Facebook page. And there's links there then to your website for Brickhouse Recovery and the book.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect. And I do think that's important to note that with the Me Too movement, we're having a conversation now, we should be anyways, about porn addiction. And I think where that, sometimes we're only focused on the symptoms, and we're not looking at what's feeding the fire. And at the heart of all of this is getting okay with vulnerability, I believe.
That's right.
And that's why we have the ReConnect podcast, to have a conversation about connection. Because I have come to know that connection is the biggest tool in fighting addiction. If I stay connected to you, like 2 weeks from now, if I'm in trouble, I can reach out to you now. We've had this face-to-face conversation, right? And I could say, Jason, I'm not in a good spot, and I need that. And that connection is so much nicer to have than using, right?
That's right.
So thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for fighting through your dark spots so that others can see where they should take those next steps. And thank you for joining the ReConnect podcast each week and sharing these. I know this podcast and many of the episodes we've done have been shared to loved ones, and that's a beautiful way to support. It's a healthy place. because someone can listen to the podcast when they're ready. And
Yeah.
you're not forcing their hand into recovery. You're saying, hey, you may want to just listen to this and see where this guy has come. I think you could relate to where he's come, and what I hear from him, I know you can offer the world. So thank you for saving lives.
Hey, you are welcome. I think it's safe to say both of us have a backstage pass to the miracle show.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. God is good. God is mighty, and he can move mighty miracles. We just have to take the step.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen.
Thanks for joining, and we'll see you again on the ReConnect podcast.
Thank you for listening to the ReConnect podcast, presented by Anasazi Foundation. Are you worried about your teenager? Are they struggling with depression, low self-esteem, anger, drugs, or suicidal thoughts and feelings? If so, Anasazi Foundation can help. Anasazi is a wilderness therapy program for at-risk youth, and our mission is to help turn hearts homeward. To learn more about us, please visit anasazi.org. If you liked this show, please be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Thank you again.